The minimum wage is a law that helped our society get out of the Great Depression, in addition to other measures like the 40-hour workweek, child labor laws, and Social Security. It'd be foolish to forget that we had none of these policies at the federal level before the 1940s. When discussing the minimum wage, it's effective to view the law as a code or a set of instructions created by the working class to prevent the employer from exploiting their workers. In today's video, I want to explore how the minimum wage came to be, how this became the standard bearer around the world, and most importantly, how the minimum wage is used in corporate media. To hopefully get you to ask a poignant question: why is it framed this way, and who benefits from this framing? Before we dive deep, I'd like to put a historical lens to this minimum wage discussion and attempt to take you back to the early 1900s, when the United States was rapidly becoming an industrial society. At the center was the city of Lawrence, largest exporter of wool in the nation, about 20 minutes inland from the Massachusetts coastline. The city of Lawrence became the bedrock of hope for tens of thousands of Italians, Poles, Syrians, French, Irish, and Jewish workers. These workers soon found out that the working conditions they would be forced into were nightmarish. Discrimination in the mills were widespread, and recruiting wagons, often referred to as slavers, would go around town seeking women and children to occupy these textile jobs. So employers could cut their labor cost in half, hiring the women and children of the town. The conditions were so bad that 1 out of 3 mill workers died by the age of 25. And the workers were starting to unionize to try to relieve themselves from the situation. One of the most popular unions was the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. This union was significant because they would organize workers from all religions, race, and genders to join the union. By 1911, after much pressure, Massachusetts legislators finally voted to reduce the work week from 56 hours to 54, starting January the following year. The workers eagerly waited to see if the first pay of the year was going to be affected by the reduced hours. The union coordinated with the workers to go on strike if the pay was cut. As usual, the union's suspicions came to fruition, the pay was cut, and the workers lost their minds. This strike came to be known as the Bread and Roses Strike of 1912, where the police opened fire and killed the fellow worker Anna Lapizzo and injured many others. The state sprayed down the women and children in freezing temperatures to stop them from protesting. Over 30,000 workers of the city halted production immediately and went on a general strike. The state soon declared martial law, curfews were set, and groups of more than 5 people couldn't gather and stand around. The media called them agitators, anarchists, rioters, and fomenters of violence. After months of workers refusing to come back, the boss's patience had run dry and demanded all the workers to come back immediately. The capitalists had planned to starve out workers. They wanted to wait for the workers' children to come crying to their parents for food. Employers knew starving children would bring back the parents. However, so did the unions. IWW had organized and coordinated a campaign with sympathetic families from different states to take in the factory workers' children until the strike came to an end. These are the photos of women and children going to the train station with little name tags describing who was going to take care of them during these strikes. The mayor of Lawrence, at the behest of the business community, eagerly waited with police and militiamen who were armed with bayonets and clubs to beat, deform, and shoot with live ammunition the women and children at the train station. They were trying to prohibit the children from leaving the state altogether, knowing full well their plan of starving them out would be foiled if the children were able to leave. The union decided to send some of their own muscle to make sure that the children had a safe exodus. They sent the man himself with a group of union friends, Big Bill Haywood, to escort the children. This man was a 6'4", nearly 300-pound miner from Utah with one eye, who was well known for brawling with militiamen and police, winning almost every time. He had a real famous saying: "I've never read Marx's Capital, but I got the marks of capital all over my body." Legend has it that the mere mention of this man's name would galvanize the workers and terrify bosses all over America. Big Bill Haywood and the IWW became public enemy number one to the employers, state, and to corporate media. Soon after the children left, the strike continued, and the employer class had no choice but to renegotiate the workers' wages. The bosses had lost so much money, they almost went bankrupt in the process. These general strikes soon laid out a detailed plan on what the workers wanted. The workers planned to be paid for more than just the bare necessities like bread. They also wanted money to live a decent lifestyle, which came to be represented as the roses in the title Bread and Roses. By March 1912, the strike was so popular that over 275,000 immigrant textile workers received similar wage increases and a decent living. This set the table for what we know today as the minimum wage law. It took a couple of decades with many more strikes around the world and many more deaths to make it a federal law, but the Bread and Roses strike laid the groundwork for its inception. There's three things to take away from this story. First, that the state and the business community colluded to stop any type of worker dissent, going at great lengths to get their way, further proving that the government's role in our society is to protect capital. Second, the overwhelming struggle and sacrifice those workers endured to get a livable wage for themselves, for workers around the world, and for future generations. And third of all, that the media has displayed a history of hostility towards the working class that persists today. And to understand those motives, we should really take a closer look at how class and media intersect by first looking at the relationship between the employer and employee. This moment when the worker goes to an interview and sits down with an employer. There's a process where the employer tells the potential employee what the job is, what time to come in, to make certain items under specific rules at an agreed upon pay. At that very moment, once the employer tells the worker the pay, the following statement becomes true. The worker produces more for the employer than what the worker gets paid. This difference between what the worker gets paid is known as necessary labor, and what the employer gets paid is called surplus labor. These are two very different ways humans get paid in our society. The worker uses their mind, muscle, and time of their life to produce value, and a portion of that value is paid back to them as their wage. Another group of people, a very small number of people in our society, get paid radically differently. They get paid by the surplus labor created by workers, often referred to as profit, which they keep to themselves. After the wage had been handed out to the worker, the rest of the time at work, the workers are creating money for the idled employer. That is why, historically speaking, workers have used the tactic of withholding their own labor when the employer class hoards too much of the profit for themselves. Similar to how the Bread and Roses strike brought decent living standards to its workers, general strikes have been one of the most successful tools against the business community since the dawn of capitalism. The importance of understanding this relationship between the employer and employee brings me to this graph. This is the evidence workers have that their relationship with their employer has gotten grotesquely uneven. In this graph, you'll notice that productivity starting in the 40s would roughly keep up with wages until the late 1960s. During that time, a CEO's compensation used to be 3 times more than a typical worker. In contrast to what it looks like today, a CEO makes nearly 400 times more than a typical worker. If wages had continued to keep up with productivity, the minimum wage would be at $27 an hour today. And how does this relate to corporate media, one might ask? Well, that surplus labor workers produced over the last 6 decades that the employers got to keep gave CEOs and board of directors enough capital to buy and control 90% of the media you consume. And they have a vested interest in growing and maintaining this wage gap. In the previous section, I established how the workers produce the profit that the employer gets to keep, and how that profit is often used to buy up the media. In this section, I hope to show you how the media frames certain topics and how this framing has nothing to do with good discourse and a robust debate, but acts as a distraction to create inaction and depoliticize the audience. A popular optic that is often used is objectively presenting a story as having 2 equal points of view.
About whether that level of wage might have unintended consequences.
In this segment, they bring 2 representatives from presumably different political lenses to get a take on what to do about this hot-button issue of raising the minimum wage. What they don't tell you is how one of these people is heavily influenced by corporations that have every interest in the world to not raise workers' wages.
David Cooper is with the Economic Policy Institute, and Douglas Holtz-Aiken is with the American Action Forum.
What the media tells you is that they're prominent spokespeople from respectable think tanks in Washington who study the subject intensely.
We explore that now with 2 who watch this closely from different political lenses.
They often leave out who platforms these think tanks that disguise themselves as nonprofit organizations, but that's a whole other video. By platforming the preferred think tank of the business community into the discussion, the media's role is to legitimize their narrative while essentially pretending to be an arbiter between 2 political views in order to help the audience make an informed decision. In this segment, a keen observer might notice that the media has framed a debate that only allows the private sector to be the only employer in our society. The parameters are set on all the networks between raising wages or limiting the amount of jobs available to workers.
The minimum wage help workers? Will it kill jobs?
But there is still no agreement on how high it can be without harming workers.
Low-income workers earn a better living or hurts them by choking the number of jobs available.
There's always one guest who argues that if workers were to raise wages, this will choke the amount of jobs available to the other workers that need jobs. Because the poor business owner would not be able to pay the adjusted wages the workers want, and that will limit the amount of jobs available in our society. This premise effectively limits the imagination of the working class to see the government as a way of adding more employment when the private sector is unwilling to do so at a higher wage. It is possible for the government to have a larger role in direct employment. The government could employ people with a federal jobs guarantee, hiring people much like it already does by employing more school teachers, more bus drivers, more postal workers, and create all sorts of new union jobs. If you want a job, the government should be able to give you one that fits your abilities. No questions asked. Similar to how Roosevelt's New Deal government guaranteed a job to all in the 30s using the Works Progress Administration.
The Works Progress Administration was launched late in 1935 as the key agency in the federal work program to employ able people from relief roles.
Despite the endless talks from the media about being objective and neutral, one can see that their framing of stories is biased towards the private sector. Workers' choices are to accept the poor wages and horrible working conditions the private sector is offering or go houseless and starve. The media's framing of themselves as unbiased while platforming only the private sector is in itself an ideological framing that fits the capitalist interest.
fair and balanced. Come on. Oh, who are we kidding?
If the media was unbiased, it would also platform guests that talk about subsidized worker co-ops or a federal jobs guarantee. But no, they rather trade in false equivalencies with the business community, leaving an uninspiring conclusion that avoids introducing any historical or class analysis into the audience's purview. The show in this segment argues that raising wages is detrimental to the very people it was meant to help, that he would love to see it happen, but that it may have unintended consequences to the working class, and we must consider these unintended consequences.
The bad news is there is no new money to pay someone $15 an hour, and so the money has to come from somewhere. And one of the places it will come from is from those people who would otherwise have gotten hired and won't now. And it seems odd to me that it would take money from someone who hasn't got a job to give it to someone who has a job. And that's a problem with the minimum wage.
The other man, acting on good faith, tries to point to studies to prove there's little debate about the outcome of raising wages.
Every study that has looked at increases in the minimum wage has concluded that the group of low-wage workers makes more at the end of the day or at the end of the year than they would have otherwise.
The other guest would try to point to a study heavily funded by the corporations that proved the opposite. The moderator goes back and forth like an 18th century waltz without ever contextualizing any of it and pretends to be intrigued by this so-called debate.
And why isn't that a good thing?
It's not the business community's job to deliver fairness, it's the government's job. There's nothing about raising the minimum wage to 15 that helps any of that, and those are problems we have right now.
So yes, there are studies that show some things, studies that show the other. There are
Left
teams
with
who can
insipid
get
facts, the segment finally draws to a conclusion with no outcome, leaving the audience more confused than when the segment started, and that's on purpose.
Well, the laws are changing, but the debate continues. And we thank both of you for joining us tonight to talk about all this.
Thank you.
Douglas Holtz-Aiken, David Cooper, we thank you.
That's exactly how they want to leave you, more confused than you started. That's the inaction created by corporate media. The next optic they use is going to interview the employer class to see what they think about raising the minimum wage. After the media had set the parameters of the debate, the logical conclusion for the media is to now tell the audience what the private sector will do to the worker if workers attempt to use the right of universal suffrage to change the material conditions of their lives. Us owners will have the last say. If I'm telling you I can't pay you $13 an hour, I'm gonna have to let you go. Once the employer class hears that workers might use the right of voting to raise wages, a set of sociopathic behaviors start occurring from the side of the business community. Hear me out. I, the employer, to not touch my own profit that the workers helped me create, will be forced to lay workers off.
Is that if minimum wage goes too high, you're going to see a lot of companies consider other options, eliminating the human.
Force others to pick up more shifts.
I have to do it with fewer people, and I have to have more out of each employee that works for me.
Raise the prices of goods and services, frame it as inflation.
And unfortunately, we have to raise our prices.
Send jobs to another country.
They stated that they're prepared to move our North American plants down to Mexico.
Use child labor if possible in the other country.
Children hack at pods of cocoa for the chocolate companies.
Or automate the job altogether.
But as technology advances, banks need fewer human workers.
What you won't hear in the media is a perspective that challenges the employer's profit. Employers could take a lot less money to secure a decent livelihood to their workers, but they choose not to. Employers could go from making 400 times more than a typical worker back to 3 times more. What we hear from the media is the employer's grievances if workers decided to raise wages in an effort to protect their millions and billions. It's easier and cheaper to buy up the media and change the discourse of conversation than to change the material conditions of workers' lives. And employers know this, and they do this without any consideration for what those effects could have on our society. How patriotic.
Fight for the rights of every man.
Historically speaking, the establishment of the minimum wage and other decency laws were formed as a type of code to insert into this economic system when it took a dump during the Great Depression. to prevent greedy employers from excessively exploiting their workers. These laws attempt to create some type of balance between the employer and employee relationship we have in our society, to make living a decent lifestyle more accessible to everyone. And contrary to what the media would have you believe, the minimum wage law was meant to guarantee a decent wage for workers and remove illegitimate businesses from operating in the first place. Don't take it from me, here's what Roosevelt said in 1933, the president that finally made minimum wage a federal law. No business which depends for existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country. By living wages, I mean more than the bare substance level. I mean the wages of a decent living. Essentially saying, if that wasn't clear enough, if you don't have enough money to pay your workers a good, decent wage, you don't have a viable business model, plain and simple. And when corporate media virtue signals about the plight of the small business owner, my recommendation to you, the worker, is to reach into your pocket and see who's pulling out your wallet. So why does corporate media continue talking endlessly with the business community to see what will happen if we raise the minimum wage? And this question brings me to the central thesis of Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky's 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent, and what they refer to as the propaganda model.
Well, on a brighter note, commercial break.
The government, he claims that the mass media brainwash under freedom. Not only do the media systematically suppress and distort, when they do present facts, the context obscures their real meaning.
The book details how this propaganda could be used in a democratic society. A propaganda model suggests that the societal purpose of the media is to inculcate, defend the economic, social, and political agenda of privileged groups that dominate the domestic society and the state. The media serves this purpose in many ways, through the selection of topic, distribution of concerns, framing of issues, filtering of information, emphasis of tone, and by keeping debate within the bounds of acceptable premises.
And political analyst Richard Stengel will be on Biden's U.S. Agency for Global Media. In 2018, Stengel told the Council on Foreign Relations about his work as the top communications specialist at the U.S. State Department.
My old job at the State Department was what people used to joke as the chief propagandist job. I'm not against propaganda. Every country does it, and they have to do it to their own population, and I don't necessarily think it's that awful.
Hopefully I was able to articulate how the media uses controlled opposition among other tactics to set the parameters of the debate over the minimum wage by framing the discussion as being between two pre-approved points of view that both serve to legitimize the employer's hegemony in our society. In this section, I hope to show you how the moderators are prone to be inculcated into the pre-approved framing of discussion, often without awareness of how they're involved in a larger scheme to oppress the working class.
Now, if the press is a censoring organization, tell me how that works. You're not suggesting that proprietors phone one another up, or that many journalists get their copy spiked, as we say?
It's actually, Orwell, you may recall, has an essay called Literary Censorship in England, which was supposed to be the introduction to Animal Farm, except that it never appeared, in which he points out, look, I'm writing about a totalitarian society, but in free democratic England, it's not all that different. And then he says unpopular ideas can be silenced without any force. And then he gives a two-sentence response, which is not very profound, but captures it. He says two reasons. First, the press is owned by wealthy men who have every interest in not having certain things appear. But second, the whole educational system, from the beginning on through, just gets you to understand that there are certain things you just don't say. Well, spelling these things out, that's perfectly correct.
This is what I don't get, because it suggests that, I mean, I'm a joke, people like me are self-censoring.
No, not self-censoring. There's a filtering system that starts in kindergarten. It goes all the way through. And It's not doesn't work 100%, but it's pretty effective. It selects for obedience and subordination.
I was brought up, like a lot of people, probably post the Watergate film and so on, to believe that journalism was a crusading craft and that there were a lot of disputatious, stroppy, difficult people in journalism. And I have to say, I think I know some of them.
Well, I know some of the best and best known investigative reporters in the United States. I won't mention names because otherwise, whose attitude toward the media is much more cynical than mine. In fact, they regard the media as a sham, and they know and they consciously talk about how they try to play it like a violin. If they see a little opening, they'll try to squeeze something in that ordinarily wouldn't make it through. And it's perfectly true that I'm sure you're speaking for the majority of journalists who are trained, have it driven into their heads that this is a crusading profession, adversarial, we stand up against power, a very self-serving view.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that journalists
self-censoring? I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
Sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
You see? Many believe that they're righteous in their spreading of employers' propaganda and how many of them may do so unknowingly. These figures in the media are often picked because the corporation wholeheartedly knows even if you gave them the material, they still wouldn't be able to come to the conclusions expressed in this video. Their subordination and obedience to the owners of the corporation won't allow it despite if they know it or not. This reminds me of a famous quote from Upton Sinclair where he once said, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it." Having corporations run our news organization is a massive conflict of interest for the working class, and it shows every day with their editorial decisions. Their headlines and framing have nothing to do with democracy or choice and has everything to do with power, to quote Henry Giroux.
And they own all the big media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls.
Politics is fundamentally subjective, and objectively presenting a story is often used as a tool when they need to shoehorn a corporate perspective into the narrative to create inaction and depoliticize the audience. Just wait until you find out how corporate media presented the climate crisis to you over the last 50 years.
The New York Times worked with Mobil Oil starting in the 70s to create the advertorial. Then they had Mobil running weekly advertorials for decades. Washington Post, they helped the American Petroleum Institute frame fossil gas as a climate solution as recently as 2020. Politico, their energy newsletter is sponsored by Chevron.
The point of this analysis goes beyond just the minimum wage. It also serves the working class to understand their relationship with their employer and their relationship with the media they consume as it represents the employer. These corporations owe the workers a lot of money, and I want to be clear, I'm not talking about a mom and pop spot trying to make it. Workers should give them time to adjust to the wages of a decent lifestyle. But all things considered, corporations have been artificially keeping our wages low for decades with the help of the media by gaslighting the public about how it's going to hurt us if we raise the minimum wage.
To the first union in American history.
Get organized, form a union, demand from your politician new legislation that protects unions. Go on strike, shame the scabs that cross the picket line, demand $30 an hour in addition to instituting a federal jobs guarantee program that helps form worker-owned cooperatives. For all the other workers out there that don't get paid minimum wage, just think how much more money you would get if the lowest paid workers in our society were now paid $30 an hour. Class solidarity is what we need right now. We really appreciate you sticking around and watching this story unfold. We really hope we ended this false narratives behind the fight to keep minimum wage low. We really love what we do, and if you can find it in your heart for the price of a beer a month, you could follow us on Patreon and allow us to continue making these stories for the working class. Let's build a better news media, one that isn't wedded together by the financial elites or by the government. We don't monetize these videos, just like and subscribe if you can chip in.